Imagine standing in the heart of a crumbling Italian landscape, where the echoes of conflict still reverberate through ancient stones. The year is 1944, and an elite contingent of German military personnel moves with calculated precision through the devastated terrain. These weren't ordinary soldiers. They were hand-picked operatives on a mission so secretive, so vital to their leadership, that failure was simply not an option. Witnesses would later recount horrifying scenes. Individuals subjected to brutal treatment, lives extinguished without mercy, entire families torn apart by indiscriminate violence. These atrocities weren't random acts of war. They were orchestrated by command, authorized from the highest echelons of power. If you enjoy stories like this, consider subscribing. Most people watching right now aren't subscribed yet. The architects of this dark mission trace their orders back to one of history's most sinister figures, Reichsführer Heinrich Himmler, the architect of the SS and one of the primary engineers of Nazi Germany's most heinous crimes against humanity. Himmler had dispatched these troops with a singular objective: to locate and secure an artifact of immense ideological significance before the advancing Allied forces could claim it. This wasn't merely a book. It represented the intellectual foundation upon which an entire genocidal regime had constructed its twisted worldview. What they sought was something the Nazi leadership considered nothing short of sacred scripture. They called it the Bible for the Aryan race, a text that purportedly offered academic legitimacy to the most abhorrent racial theories ever conceived. Within its pages lay what the Nazis believed was irrefutable proof of their racial superiority, a historical document that would validate their claims of Germanic dominance and justify their systematic elimination of those they deemed inferior. The manuscript in question provided what appeared to be scholarly justification for the notion that humanity could be divided into distinct racial categories, with some inherently superior to others. Once such a framework was established, once the idea took root that certain populations possessed lesser value, lesser capability, lesser humanity, the logical conclusion became terrifyingly clear. If some races were fundamentally inferior, then their subjugation, their enslavement, and ultimately their extermination could be rationalized as not merely permissible, but necessary. This ideological foundation would prove catastrophic. The book's interpretation would directly enable the construction of death camps, the mechanized murder of millions, and one of history's darkest chapters. But the story of how this manuscript became so central to Nazi ideology, how it was hunted across a continent, and how it ultimately escaped the grasp of those who would weaponize it, is a narrative that reveals the dangerous intersection of historical distortion, academic corruption, and totalitarian ambition. Here's where the mystery deepens. What was this book, and why did the most powerful men in Nazi Germany become so obsessed with possessing it? To understand the Nazi fixation on this particular manuscript, we must first examine the political landscape of early 20th century Germany. When Adolf Hitler ascended to the chancellorship in January 1933, his position was far more precarious than the triumphant propaganda suggested. The Nazi Party had secured less than 50% of the popular vote, a significant achievement certainly, but hardly the overwhelming mandate that Hitler's rhetoric proclaimed. The nation remained fractured along ideological, regional, and class lines. The challenge facing the new regime was monumental. How does one unite a population that had, mere decades earlier, been fragmented into dozens of independent principalities and kingdoms? The solution the Nazi leadership devised was ingenious in its psychological manipulation. They would construct a unifying mythology. Rather than attempting to bridge existing divisions through policy or compromise, they would create a shared narrative of national destiny, a story so compelling and so flattering to German pride that it would transcend regional and class boundaries. This mythology would become the adhesive binding the German people to the Nazi state. The central element of this mythological framework was the concept of Aryan superiority. The Nazis propagated the notion that the German people were the direct descendants of an ancient master race known as the Aryans. According to Nazi ideology, these Aryans possessed qualities that set them fundamentally apart from all other human populations: superior intellect, unparalleled warrior spirit, and an innate capacity for civilization building that no other people could match. The Nazi historical narrative became increasingly elaborate and fantastical. They claimed that the Aryans had originated in Atlantis, the legendary island civilization first described by the ancient Greek philosopher Plato. From this mythical homeland, the story continued. These superior beings had migrated northward, eventually settling on the North German plains. There, according to Nazi historiography, they had established the foundations of European civilization itself, predating and surpassing the achievements of the Greeks and Romans. The physical characteristics attributed to these Aryan ancestors were equally specific and ideologically convenient. They were described as tall, with flaxen hair and piercing blue eyes. Essentially, they looked like the idealized image of Nordic Germanic peoples. They were portrayed as fearless warriors, possessed of unshakable loyalty to their leaders and an almost mystical connection to the land they inhabited. In the Nazi imagination, these ancient Aryans represented everything that modern Germans should aspire to become. But here's the critical problem that threatened to unravel the entire mythological edifice. There was no archaeological evidence, no historical documentation, no tangible proof that this master race had ever actually existed. The Nazis faced a credibility crisis. They could construct elaborate narratives and produce stirring propaganda, but without historical evidence, their claims remained vulnerable to intellectual challenge. They needed something more substantial. They needed a historical text, preferably written by a respected ancient authority, that would validate their theories and provide academic legitimacy to their racial ideology. And then, as if by providence, the Nazi leadership became aware of a manuscript that seemed to offer exactly what they needed. It was an ancient Roman text, written nearly 2,000 years before, that described in detail a Germanic people living in the forests of northern Europe. The text portrayed these Germanic tribes as fierce, independent, and possessed of qualities that even the mighty Roman Empire had found impossible to conquer. The manuscript was called the Germania, and it had been written by Cornelius Tacitus, one of Rome's most respected historians. For the Nazi leadership, the discovery of this text seemed almost miraculous. Here was a document written by a credible ancient source that appeared to confirm their most cherished beliefs about Germanic superiority. The Germania would become the cornerstone of Nazi racial ideology, the historical foundation upon which they would construct their most murderous policies. But what the Nazis didn't realize, or perhaps chose to ignore, was that Tacitus's actual account was far more complex, far more ambiguous, and far less flattering than their selective interpretation suggested. To fully comprehend the Nazi obsession with Tacitus and his Germania, we must first understand who Tacitus was and what his actual historical work contained. Cornelius Tacitus lived during the 1st and early 2nd centuries of the Roman Empire, a period of extraordinary power and territorial expansion for Rome. He was born around the year 56 AD and would eventually rise to prominence as one of the most accomplished orators and political figures of his generation. His career culminated in his election as consul, one of the highest positions in the Roman state, and his subsequent recognition as perhaps the greatest historian Rome had ever produced. Tacitus wrote during what many scholars consider the most decadent period in Roman history. His historical works provide unflinching accounts of the reigns of emperors such as Tiberius, Claudius, and Nero, rulers whose names have become synonymous with tyranny, excess, and moral corruption. Tacitus documented their sordid intrigues, their paranoid purges, their sexual depravities, with a precision and candor that remains remarkable even by modern standards. His willingness to criticize the powerful, to expose the rot at the heart of imperial governance, established him as a historian of extraordinary integrity and courage. Yet when Tacitus turned his attention to the Germanic peoples living beyond Rome's northern frontier, his tone shifted dramatically. Rather than the critical skepticism he applied to Roman emperors, Tacitus adopted what appeared to be an admiring, almost reverential perspective. He described the Germanic tribes with what seemed like genuine respect, even praise. He wrote of their fierce devotion to liberty, their rejection of the corrupting influences that had weakened Rome, their maintenance of martial virtues that Roman civilization had largely abandoned. In the Germania, Tacitus provided detailed descriptions of Germanic culture and society. He wrote about the gods they worshipped, the methods by which they selected their leaders, the weapons they employed in battle, and their rigorous system of training young men to become warriors. He commented on their sexual morality, noting with apparent approval their chastity and their lack of interest in material accumulation. He observed that no one in Germany laughs at vice, nor do they call it the fashion to corrupt and to be corrupted. He noted that they choose their kings by birth, their generals by merit, suggesting a meritocratic system of leadership that contrasted favorably with Roman hereditary aristocracy. Most significantly, for the Nazi interpretation, Tacitus provided physical descriptions of the Germanic peoples. He wrote of their fierce blue eyes, their blonde hair, their massive frames, physical characteristics that seemed to match perfectly the idealized image of the Aryan master race that Nazi ideology promoted. For the Nazi leadership and the intellectuals who served them, these descriptions appeared to be historical confirmation of everything they believed about Germanic racial superiority. But what the Nazis systematically ignored or deliberately obscured was the full context of Tacitus's account, the passages that presented a far less flattering portrait of Germanic society. Tacitus, in fact, attributed numerous negative characteristics to the Germanic tribes. He wrote extensively about their tendency toward excessive drinking, describing how they would spend entire days and nights in alcoholic consumption without shame or restraint. He noted their propensity for violent quarrels, observing that their quarrels are seldom fought out with mere abuse, but commonly with wounds and bloodshed. He commented on what he perceived as their addiction to gambling, a vice he seemed to view with considerable disapproval. Perhaps most damaging to the Nazi interpretation, Tacitus described what he saw as a fundamental laziness in Germanic character. He wrote that they pass much of their time in idleness, giving themselves up to sleep and to feasting, and he observed with evident disdain that the bravest and most warlike do nothing. This was hardly the portrait of a disciplined, industrious master race that Nazi ideology required. Furthermore, Tacitus made observations about Germanic children that contradicted the Nazi vision of a pure, superior people. He wrote that, in every household, the children, naked and filthy, grow up in that rude simplicity of body and mind which I regard with admiration. But he also suggested that these children will be overcome by their own vices as easily as by the arms of an enemy. This was not the description of a genetically superior population destined to rule the world. The critical question becomes, did Tacitus actually believe what he was writing about the Germanic peoples, or was he engaging in a more subtle form of social criticism? Modern scholars have developed increasingly sophisticated interpretations of Tacitus's Germania, and their conclusions challenge the Nazi reading in fundamental ways. Many historians now believe that Tacitus was not primarily interested in providing an objective ethnographic account of Germanic society. Instead, they argue, he was using the Germanic peoples as a literary device, a mirror in which Roman society could examine its own moral decline. This interpretation suggests that Tacitus was engaging in what scholars call noble savage rhetoric. By portraying the Germanic tribes as possessing virtues that Roman civilization had lost, simplicity, martial courage, sexual morality, freedom from corruption, Tacitus was implicitly criticizing Roman decadence. He was not necessarily claiming that the Germanic peoples were actually superior. Rather, he was using them as an idealized contrast to highlight Roman failings. It was a rhetorical strategy, a form of social commentary, not a historical claim about racial superiority. This interpretation becomes even more compelling when we consider a crucial fact that the Nazis either ignored or deliberately concealed. Tacitus had almost certainly never actually seen any of the Germanic peoples he was describing. He had no direct experience of Germanic society, no first-hand knowledge of their customs and character. His account was based on reports from others, on hearsay, on literary sources, not on personal observation or rigorous investigation. Moreover, as Tacitus's account progresses, it becomes increasingly fantastical. Toward the end of the Germania, he describes peoples living in the far north, whose physical characteristics become increasingly bizarre and inhuman. He writes of people with human faces but animal bodies, of creatures that seem to belong more to mythology than to ethnography. This descent into fantasy suggests that Tacitus himself was aware that his account was becoming increasingly speculative and unreliable as he moved further from the regions he had any knowledge of. The implications are profound. The Nazi leadership had constructed their entire racial ideology, had justified the systematic murder of millions on the basis of a historical text written by an author who had never visited the regions he described, who was likely engaging in rhetorical criticism rather than historical documentation, and whose account became increasingly fantastical and unreliable as it progressed. Yet despite these fundamental problems with the historical accuracy and reliability of Tacitus's account, the Nazi regime had seized upon it as the cornerstone of their ideological justification for genocide. The question becomes, how did this happen? How did a sophisticated, educated leadership embrace such a fundamentally flawed interpretation of a classical text? The answer lies in the story of one man whose obsession with the Germania would shape the ideology and policies of Nazi Germany: Heinrich Himmler. In 1924, a young man named Heinrich Himmler, a failed chicken farmer with intellectual pretensions, boarded a train for a long journey. During that journey, he would read Tacitus's Germania for the first time, and his life and the fate of millions would be forever altered. Himmler was not a particularly impressive figure. He was physically unimposing, bookish in appearance, with the kind of mild demeanor that suggested he might be more comfortable in a library than in positions of power. Yet appearances were profoundly deceiving. Himmler possessed an almost obsessive personality, a capacity for meticulous organization, and a willingness to pursue his ideological convictions with ruthless determination. These qualities would eventually make him one of the most powerful and most dangerous men in Nazi Germany. As Himmler read Tacitus's account of the ancient Germanic peoples, something within him resonated profoundly. Here, in the words of a respected Roman historian, he found confirmation of beliefs he already held. The Germania seemed to validate his conviction that the Germanic peoples possessed inherent superiority, that they were descended from a master race, that they possessed qualities that set them fundamentally apart from other human populations. Himmler was so moved by what he read that he confided his reactions to his personal diary. He wrote of being lost in the glorious image of the loftiness, purity, and nobleness of our ancestors. He expressed his fervent hope that the German people of his own time might somehow recapture these qualities, might restore themselves to the elevated status that their ancient forebears had supposedly possessed. The Germania had become, for Himmler, something approaching sacred scripture, a historical document that revealed the true nature and destiny of the German people. But Himmler's obsession with Tacitus would not remain a private intellectual pursuit. As he rose to power within the Nazi state, he would use his position to transform his interpretation of the Germania into official state ideology, with catastrophic consequences for millions of people. Throughout the 1930s, Heinrich Himmler's influence within the Nazi state grew steadily and inexorably. While Hitler remained the supreme leader, the public face of the regime, Himmler operated in the shadows, accumulating power through careful political maneuvering and the cultivation of loyal subordinates. He rose to become the head of the SS, the Schutzstaffel, an elite paramilitary organization that would eventually control vast portions of the Nazi state apparatus. The SS was not merely a military unit. It was conceived as the vanguard of a new Germanic civilization, the embodiment of the racial ideals that Himmler had absorbed from his reading of Tacitus. Himmler deliberately shaped the SS in the image of the warrior society that Tacitus had described. SS members were indoctrinated with the belief that they represented the continuation of the ancient Germanic warrior tradition, that they were the modern incarnation of the noble tribes that had resisted Roman conquest. Himmler's vision extended far beyond the SS itself. He believed that the entire German state should be reorganized according to the principles that Tacitus had attributed to ancient Germanic society. The Germania became, in Himmler's conception, a blueprint for the reconstruction of German civilization. Every German citizen should aspire to embody the virtues that Tacitus had praised: martial courage, loyalty to the leader, sexual morality, freedom from corruption, and above all, racial purity. To promote this vision, Himmler commissioned the construction of an enormous hall at the 1936 Nazi Party convention, a gathering that would attract hundreds of thousands of party members from across Germany. This Germanic hall was decorated with massive panels featuring quotations from Tacitus, celebrating the virtues of the ancient Germanic peoples. Above the entrance was inscribed a quotation from Hitler himself: "German youth shall know manly loyalty was the virtue of the old Gnan. The new state is erected upon that virtue." The message was unmistakable. The Nazi state was not merely a modern political regime. It was the restoration of an ancient Germanic civilization, the resurrection of the noble society that Tacitus had described nearly 2,000 years before. Every aspect of Nazi policy, every law, every institution was justified by reference to this idealized vision of Germanic antiquity. But Himmler's use of Tacitus extended far beyond symbolic gestures and ideological rhetoric. He employed the Germania to justify the most evil and murderous policies of the Nazi regime. In 1935, the Nazi government implemented the first of what would become a series of racial laws designed to segregate and ultimately eliminate the Jewish population of Europe. These laws were called the Law for the Protection of German Blood and Honor, and they prohibited marriages between Aryans and Jews. The justification for these laws came directly from Tacitus. Himmler and the Nazi legal theorists pointed to a specific passage in the Germania in which Tacitus wrote that the Germans are a people unto themselves, implying that they had never mixed with other races, that they maintained racial purity through strict endogamy. This single sentence, taken out of context and deliberately misinterpreted, became the legal and ideological foundation for Nazi racial legislation. Once the concept of racial purity had been established as a fundamental principle of state policy, the logical progression toward genocide became almost inevitable. If the Germans were a pure race, descended from superior Aryan ancestors, then the presence of other races within German territory represented a form of contamination. If some races were inherently inferior, then their subjugation and elimination could be justified as necessary for the preservation of racial purity and national strength. The intellectual framework for genocide had been constructed, brick by brick, using Tacitus's words as the mortar. The consequences were catastrophic. Over 11 million people would be systematically murdered in Nazi concentration camps and extermination centers. The vast majority of these victims were Jewish, but the Nazi genocide also claimed the lives of Roma, disabled individuals, political prisoners, Soviet prisoners of war, and countless others deemed racially or socially undesirable. The direct line could be traced from Himmler's reading of Tacitus on a train in 1924 to the gas chambers of Auschwitz and Treblinka. This is the terrible power of historical distortion, of the weaponization of scholarship in service of ideology. A Roman historian's rhetorical critique of Roman decadence, written nearly 2,000 years before, had been transformed into the intellectual justification for one of history's greatest atrocities. But Himmler's obsession with Tacitus did not end with the use of the Germania to justify Nazi racial policies. He became determined to possess something even more precious: the original manuscript itself, the oldest surviving copy of Tacitus's work. Himmler's desire to possess the original manuscript of the Germania was not merely a matter of scholarly interest or historical curiosity. For Himmler, the physical possession of the text represented something approaching religious significance. The manuscript was not simply a book. It was a sacred relic, a tangible connection to the ancient Germanic past that he believed the Nazi state was destined to restore. To locate and acquire this precious manuscript, Himmler turned to one of the most unusual and sinister institutions created by the Nazi regime, the Ahnenerbe, or the Ancestral Heritage Organization. The Ahnenerbe had been established by Himmler in 1935 as a research institute dedicated to investigating and promoting Nazi theories of Germanic racial superiority and Aryan origins. The Ahnenerbe was staffed by approximately 200 individuals, including roughly 100 academics of various disciplines: historians, archaeologists, anthropologists, and philologists. These were not merely propagandists or ideological hacks. Many were genuine scholars and researchers who had been drawn into the service of Nazi ideology. Alongside these legitimate academics worked cranks, pseudoscientists, and true believers in Nazi racial mythology. The Ahnenerbe represented a profound corruption of academic integrity and intellectual honesty. These scholars were tasked with rewriting history to support Nazi ideological claims, with constructing an elaborate mythology of Aryan superiority, with selectively interpreting historical and archaeological evidence to support predetermined conclusions. They were not engaged in genuine historical research. They were engaged in the systematic distortion of history in service of totalitarian ideology. Yet the Ahnenerbe was not merely a harmless collection of corrupted academics engaged in intellectual dishonesty. The work they performed had direct and murderous consequences. The racial theories they promoted, the historical narratives they constructed, the pseudo-scientific justifications they provided for Nazi racial policies, all of this contributed to the creation of a worldview that was fundamentally evil, a worldview that justified the systematic murder of millions. On Himmler's orders, the Ahnenerbe began an intensive search for the original manuscript of Tacitus's Germania. They scoured libraries and archives across Europe, following leads and rumors, pursuing every possible clue that might lead them to the precious text. The search was conducted with the resources and determination of a state apparatus, with the authority to compel cooperation from institutions and individuals across occupied Europe. The Ahnenerbe researchers eventually encountered a significant problem. The original manuscript of Tacitus no longer existed. During the collapse of the Roman Empire and the subsequent centuries of the Dark Ages, countless precious documents had been lost to fire, decay, and the general chaos of historical upheaval. The original text that Tacitus himself had written had vanished into the mists of time, leaving no trace. But there remained a glimmer of hope. The Ahnenerbe discovered that during the Middle Ages, a single perfect copy of Tacitus's Germania had been made. According to historical records, a traveling Italian scholar had journeyed to a monastery in southern Germany during the mid-15th century and had painstakingly copied the entire text of the Germania by hand. This manuscript, known as the Codex Asinus, represented the closest surviving link to Tacitus's original work. The Codex Asinus became the object of Himmler's obsessive quest. He was determined to locate this manuscript, to possess it, to display it as a symbol of Nazi Germany's connection to its supposed Aryan past. The search eventually yielded results. In 1936, the Ahnenerbe reported to Himmler that they had located the Codex Asinus. The manuscript had been traced to Italy, where it had lain in obscurity for approximately 200 years in the vast private library of an Italian nobleman, Count Aurelio Balestri Balani. The Count's family had accumulated an impressive collection of historical documents and literary works, including letters of the famous lover Casanova and writings of the Roman orator Cicero. Among these treasures, the Codex Asinus had been largely forgotten, its historical significance unrecognized by the family that possessed it. The Count himself was completely unaware of the importance that the Nazi regime attached to this particular manuscript. To him, it was simply one item among many in a family collection, a historical document of some interest, but hardly the most valuable or significant piece in his possession. He had no idea that the most powerful men in Nazi Germany were becoming obsessed with acquiring it. But Himmler's determination to possess the Codex Asinus would set in motion a chain of events that would span continents, survive a world war, and ultimately preserve the manuscript for posterity, though not in the way that Himmler had envisioned. In 1936, Italy was ruled by Benito Mussolini, another fascist dictator who had seized power in 1922 and declared himself Il Duce, the leader. Like Hitler, Mussolini was a brutal populist politician who had consolidated power through violence, intimidation, and the suppression of all opposition. Throughout the 1930s, Hitler had carefully cultivated a relationship with his Italian counterpart, recognizing that an alliance with Italy would provide Germany with a powerful partner in its quest for European dominance. When Himmler informed Hitler of the location of the Codex Aeschines and expressed his desire to acquire it, Hitler saw an opportunity to strengthen his relationship with Mussolini. He petitioned the Italian dictator to obtain the manuscript and present it to Nazi Germany as a gift. From Mussolini's perspective, this seemed like a reasonable request from his German ally. He ordered his government to approach Count Balestri-Bellani and request that he surrender the manuscript to the Italian state, which would then present it to Germany. Himmler was confident that the matter would be quickly resolved. He began making preparations for a triumphant presentation of the Codex Aeschines at the 1936 Nazi Party convention. He envisioned displaying the manuscript in the enormous Germanic hall that had been constructed for the occasion, presenting it to the assembled party members as physical proof of the connection between modern Germany and its supposed Aryan ancestors. But Himmler had not reckoned with the stubbornness and independence of Count Aurelio Balestri-Bellani. The Count was not a man accustomed to being ordered about by political authorities. He was a member of the Italian aristocracy, a man of considerable wealth and social standing, and he possessed a strong sense of personal dignity and family honor. More importantly, the Count harbored a deep contempt for Mussolini and fascism. He found the Italian dictator ridiculous and pompous, and he had no intention of allowing himself to be manipulated by Mussolini's government. When an emissary from Mussolini's government arrived at the Count's villa to request the surrender of the Codex Aeschines, the Count refused. He would not hand over the manuscript simply because a dictator demanded it. The Count's refusal was not merely an act of defiance. It was an act of principle. He believed that the manuscript belonged to his family, that it was part of their cultural heritage, and that no government had the right to seize it. Himmler was infuriated by the Count's refusal. His carefully laid plans had been thwarted by the obstinacy of an Italian nobleman. To make matters worse, Hitler himself was beginning to lose interest in Himmler's obsession with Germanic mythology and historical artifacts. In private conversations, Hitler had made dismissive comments about the scholars and intellectuals who surrounded Himmler, suggesting that their preoccupation with the distant Germanic past contributed little to the practical exercise of political power. Hitler was focused on conquest and domination in the present. He had little patience for Himmler's antiquarian pursuits. But Himmler refused to abandon his quest. He continued to apply pressure on the Count through various channels, sending emissaries to negotiate, to persuade, to intimidate. The interest in acquiring the Codex Aeschines remained intense, and the Nazi regime made repeated attempts to obtain the manuscript. After 2 years of mounting pressure and repeated negotiations, Count Balestri-Bellani finally made a concession, though not the one that Himmler had hoped for. The Count agreed that the Germans could not have permanent possession of the manuscript, but he would allow them to examine it and to produce photographs of the text. Just before the outbreak of the Second World War, the Count carefully packed the Codex Aeschines and sent it to Rome, where it would be photographed for Himmler's benefit. In Rome, the manuscript was presented to Rolf Till, a member of the Ahnenerbe who had been sent to examine it. Till was given access to the Codex Aeschines and was able to produce a complete set of photographs of the entire text. Using these photographs, the Ahnenerbe produced a Nazi edition of the Codex Aeschines, complete with an introduction written by Himmler himself. In this introduction, Himmler wrote, "The future will only be granted to those who understand the stock of their ancestry." But for Himmler, even this was not sufficient. He had only a facsimile, a reproduction of the original. He remained determined to possess the actual manuscript, to hold in his hands the physical text that connected him to the ancient Germanic past. He believed that one day, circumstances would provide him with the opportunity to seize the Codex Aeschines by force. That opportunity would come sooner than anyone expected, when Hitler plunged the world into war and Italy became the battleground where Himmler's obsession would finally be tested. In September 1939, Adolf Hitler launched the invasion of Poland, plunging Europe into the Second World War. For the next 6 years, the continent would be consumed by conflict of unprecedented scale and brutality. Italy, under Mussolini's leadership, became Germany's most important ally, and the two fascist powers coordinated their military efforts in an attempt to dominate Europe and beyond. The war progressed through various phases. Initially, German military forces achieved spectacular successes, conquering much of continental Europe and pushing deep into the Soviet Union. But as the years passed, the tide gradually turned against the Axis powers. The Soviet Union, despite suffering catastrophic losses, continued to resist and eventually began pushing German forces back westward. The United States, having entered the war in 1941, provided enormous material support to the Allied cause. Britain, under Winston Churchill's leadership, refused to surrender, despite the threat of invasion and the devastating bombing campaign directed against its cities. By 1943, it became clear that the Axis powers were facing defeat. The Allies launched an invasion of Sicily and southern Italy, establishing a foothold on the European continent. The Italian people, exhausted by years of war and disillusioned with Mussolini's leadership, rose up in revolt. Mussolini was overthrown and arrested, and Italy switched its allegiance to the Allies, declaring war on Germany. For Hitler, this Italian defection was a catastrophe. He could not allow the Allies to consolidate their position in Italy and use it as a springboard for further advances into Europe. He was forced to send German troops into Italy to shore up his southern flank, to prevent the Allies from advancing northward, and to maintain German control over as much of the Italian peninsula as possible. For Himmler, the German military presence in Italy represented an unexpected opportunity. The Codex Aecinus was still in Italy, still in the possession of the Balestri-Balani family. With German troops now operating in Italian territory, Himmler saw his chance to finally seize the manuscript that had eluded him for so many years. He dispatched an entire unit of SS troops to the region, with explicit orders to locate the Codex Aecinus and bring it back to Germany. The SS soldiers who were sent on this mission understood that they were searching for something of great importance to their leadership. They had been given detailed descriptions of the manuscript and explicit instructions to recover it at any cost. As they advanced through the Italian countryside, they began searching the properties known to be owned by the Balestri-Balani family. The Count's family owned 3 properties: 2 urban palaces located in towns, and a country villa situated outside the town of Viterbo. The manuscript could potentially be hidden in any of these locations, or it might have been moved to some other hiding place entirely. The SS troops began their search methodically, starting with the villa outside Viterbo. When the German soldiers arrived at the villa, they found it empty. The Count, anticipating the German advance and fearing for the safety of his family, had evacuated them from the villa just days before the SS troops arrived. But the Count's servants, loyal to their employer and determined to protect the family's possessions, had not abandoned everything to the Germans. They had carefully removed the most valuable items from the villa and transported them to one of the Count's other properties, his palazzo located in the town of Viterbo itself, only a few miles away. The servants had employed an ingenious method of concealment. They had hidden the Count's treasures in agricultural carts, burying them beneath piles of farm produce, wheat, grain, and other crops. In the chaos of wartime, with countless carts moving through the countryside carrying supplies and refugees, the Count's hidden treasures passed unnoticed by the German occupiers. But the SS troops soon discovered evidence that the most valuable items had been moved to the palazzo in Viterbo, and they immediately redirected their search to that location. When the German soldiers arrived at the palazzo in Viterbo, they demanded access to the building and began a thorough search. The household staff, the servants, the cooks, the caretakers, were interrogated aggressively about the location of the manuscript. Some of them may have pretended not to understand the German language, risking their lives in the process. Others simply refused to cooperate. maintaining their loyalty to the Count despite the danger they faced. The SS troops searched the palazzo thoroughly, but they found neither the Codex Aecinas nor any members of the Balestri-Balani family. The Count had moved his family to yet another of his properties, a palazzo located in the town of Osimo, approximately 30 kilometers away. The family had decided that Osimo, being further from the main German military positions, would offer greater safety. The SS troops, frustrated by their repeated failures to locate either the manuscript or the family, now turned their attention to the third property, the palazzo in Osimo. But before they could conduct their search there, they would encounter the full horror of Nazi occupation. From their hiding place in Osimo, the Balestri-Balani family witnessed scenes of unimaginable brutality. Children peered from windows and saw people beaten, saw individuals shot without mercy, saw the casual exercise of Nazi violence against the Italian civilian population. The palazzo in Osimo became the site of a tense and terrifying confrontation between the SS troops and the Balestri-Balani family. The German soldiers arrived at the building and began demanding entry. They knocked loudly at the doors, their aggressive behavior making clear that they would not be denied access. The family, aware of the violence that the Germans had perpetrated against the civilian population, lived in constant fear that the soldiers would break down the doors and seize them. The Count's children, who were only 9 and 10 years old at the time, remember the experience with vivid clarity even decades later. They recall the sound of the German soldiers pounding on the doors, the terror they felt at the possibility that their father might be taken away, that their family might be torn apart, that they might all be murdered by these brutal occupiers. But the palazzo in Osimo contained a secret that the German soldiers did not know about. Hidden beneath the building was a network of cellars and underground chambers. These subterranean spaces had been constructed centuries before, when the palazzo was first built, and they had been maintained and expanded over the generations. The family knew about these hidden chambers, and when the German soldiers arrived, the entire family retreated into the cellars and sealed themselves inside. The Count's children spent 18 days in those cellars without ever emerging to the surface. They lived in darkness and fear, sustained by whatever food and water the family had managed to bring with them. They could hear the German soldiers moving through the palazzo above them, searching through rooms, opening cupboards, looking for any sign of the family or the manuscript. But the German soldiers never discovered the cellar door. The entrance to the underground chambers was concealed behind a false wall, hidden by a wardrobe that had been positioned in front of it. The soldiers searched the palazzo thoroughly, but they never found the secret door, and the Balestri-Balani family remained safe in their underground refuge. More importantly, the Codex Aecinas remained hidden. The manuscript had never left the first property that the German soldiers had searched, the villa outside Viterbo. The Count had hidden it in a secret room within the villa, a room that was itself concealed behind a false window and protected by a hidden door that was further secured by a piece of furniture positioned in front of it. Inside this secret room, concealed within a simple chest that was typically used for storing laundry, lay the Codex Aecinas, the manuscript that Himmler had obsessed over for so many years, the text that he believed would validate Nazi racial ideology and justify the genocide of millions, remained hidden from the German occupiers. Despite all of Himmler's power, despite all of the resources of the Nazi state, despite the presence of German troops throughout Italy, he was unable to seize the manuscript that he so desperately desired. The war continued for another 2 years after the German search for the Codex Aecinas. The Allies gradually pushed northward through Italy, liberating territory from German control. The Soviet Union, having survived the German invasion and mobilized its enormous resources, began a relentless advance westward, pushing German forces back toward their homeland. The United States and Britain, having established air superiority, subjected German cities to devastating bombing campaigns. By May 1945, it was all over. Germany surrendered unconditionally to the Allied powers. Hitler, facing inevitable defeat, shot himself in his Berlin bunker. Himmler, captured by British forces, swallowed a cyanide capsule while in custody, taking his own life rather than face trial for his crimes. With the death of Himmler and the collapse of the Nazi regime, the hunt for the Codex Aesinas came to an end. But the story of the manuscript was far from over. With the Nazi threat eliminated and the war in Europe concluded, the Balestri-Balani family could finally emerge from hiding and reclaim their lives. The secret room in their villa outside Viterbo, which had protected the Codex Aesinas from Nazi seizure, could now be opened. The manuscript that had been concealed for so long could finally be brought back into the light. The Italian government, recognizing the historical and cultural significance of the Codex Aesinas, declared it a national treasure. The Balestri-Balani family, understanding the importance of the manuscript and the responsibility that came with possessing it, agreed to display it in their library in Viterbo, where it could be preserved and studied by scholars. For the next 20 years, the Codex Aesinas remained in the Balestri-Balani family collection. Every year, inspectors from the Italian government would visit the villa to verify that the manuscript was still in the family's possession and that it was being properly maintained and preserved. The manuscript had survived the Nazi occupation, had escaped the grasp of one of history's most evil regimes, and was now being carefully protected by the family that had risked so much to preserve it. But in 1966, disaster struck. The Italian government requested that the Count bring the Codex Aesinas to Florence so that government inspectors could examine it there. The Count, understanding the importance of the request and the significance of the manuscript, agreed. He carefully packed the precious text and transported it to Florence, where he placed it in an underground bank vault overnight for safekeeping. He planned to present it to the inspectors the following day. But that night, Florence experienced the worst flooding in its recorded history. On November 4, 1966, torrential rains caused the Arno River to overflow its banks, inundating the city with water. The underground vault, where the Codex Aesinas had been stored, was not waterproof. Water, mixed with oil and other contaminants, flooded into the vault and damaged countless precious documents and artworks that had been stored there for protection. The Codex Aesinas suffered severe damage. The first 2 or 3 pages and the last 2 or 3 pages were almost completely destroyed. The ink had been washed away or turned black, making the text nearly illegible. The parchment itself had been warped and damaged by the water. It appeared that this precious manuscript, which had survived Nazi occupation and the horrors of war, had finally been destroyed by an act of nature. But the Balestri-Balani family and the Italian government refused to accept this outcome. They commissioned a team of expert conservators and restoration specialists to undertake the painstaking work of restoring the damaged manuscript. For months, these experts worked carefully to repair the damage, to stabilize the parchment, to restore the legibility of the text. Gradually, through their meticulous efforts, the Codex Aesinas was brought back from the brink of destruction. The restoration was successful. The manuscript, though bearing the scars of its ordeal, was preserved. The text remained readable, and the historical document that had been the object of Himmler's obsession could continue to serve its proper purpose, as a source of historical knowledge and scholarly study. After nearly 200 years of being held in private family collections, the Balestri-Balani family made a momentous decision. They recognized that the Codex Aesinas was too important to remain in private hands, that it should be available to scholars and researchers from all nations, that it should be preserved in a public institution where it could be properly maintained and studied. The family donated the Codex Aesinas to the Biblioteca Nazionale in Rome, where it remains to this day, available for examination by scholars and researchers from around the world. Now that the Codex Aesinas is available for scholarly examination, now that experts from all nations can study the actual text, rather than relying on Nazi interpretations and Nazi editions, a very different picture of Tacitus and his Germania has emerged. The scholarly consensus that has developed over the past several decades fundamentally challenges the Nazi reading of the text and reveals the extent to which the Nazi regime had distorted and misrepresented Tacitus's actual account. Modern scholars have come to recognize that Tacitus's descriptions of the Germanic peoples were far more ambiguous and far less flattering than the Nazi interpretation suggested. Tacitus attributed numerous negative characteristics to the Germanic tribes, characteristics that the Nazi regime had systematically ignored or downplayed in their selective quotations from the text. Tacitus wrote extensively about the Germanic people's tendency toward excessive drinking. He described how they would spend entire days and nights in alcoholic consumption, how they seemed to take no shame in this behavior. This was hardly the portrait of a disciplined, morally elevated master race that Nazi ideology required. Yet this passage appears nowhere in Nazi editions of the Germania, nowhere in the propaganda that Himmler and his associates produced. Tacitus also commented on the Germanic people's propensity for violent quarrels and bloodshed. He noted their addiction to gambling, a vice that he seemed to view with considerable disapproval. He described what he perceived as a fundamental laziness in Germanic character, observing that even the bravest and most warlike spent much of their time in idleness and sleep. These descriptions contradicted the Nazi image of a race of disciplined, industrious warriors. Furthermore, Tacitus made observations about Germanic children that suggested they were not the products of some superior genetic stock. He wrote that, in every household, the children, naked and filthy, grow up in that rude simplicity, and he suggested that these children will be overcome by their own vices as easily as by the arms of an enemy. This was not the description of a genetically superior population destined to rule the world. Modern scholars have also recognized that Tacitus was almost certainly not providing an objective ethnographic account of Germanic society. Instead, they argue, he was employing a literary device known as the noble savage trope. By portraying the Germanic peoples as possessing virtues that Roman civilization had lost, simplicity, martial courage, sexual morality, freedom from corruption, Tacitus was implicitly criticizing Roman decadence and moral decline. This interpretation suggests that Tacitus was not claiming that the Germanic peoples were actually superior to Romans. Rather, he was using them as an idealized contrast to highlight the failings of Roman society. It was a rhetorical strategy, a form of social commentary, not a historical claim about racial superiority. The Nazi regime had taken a piece of Roman social criticism and transformed it into a justification for genocide. Even more damaging to the Nazi interpretation is the recognition that Tacitus had almost certainly never actually seen any of the Germanic peoples he was describing. Tacitus had no direct experience of Germanic society. He had never traveled to the Germanic territories. His account was based on reports from others, on hearsay, on literary sources, not on personal observation or rigorous investigation. He was writing about a people and a culture that he had no first-hand knowledge of, relying on second-hand accounts and his own literary imagination. This becomes even more apparent when one examines the later portions of the Germania, where Tacitus describes peoples living in the far north. As his account progresses, it becomes increasingly fantastical. He describes peoples with human faces but animal bodies, creatures that seem to belong more to mythology than to ethnography. This descent into fantasy suggests that Tacitus himself was aware that his account was becoming increasingly speculative and unreliable as he moved further from the regions he had any knowledge of. The implications are profound and deeply troubling. The Nazi leadership had constructed their entire racial ideology, had justified the systematic murder of millions of people on the basis of a historical text written by an author who had never visited the regions he described, who was likely engaging in rhetorical criticism rather than historical documentation, and whose account became increasingly fantastical and unreliable as it progressed. The Nazi regime had taken a work of Roman literature, had deliberately misinterpreted it, had selectively quoted from it while ignoring passages that contradicted their ideology, and had used it to justify one of history's greatest atrocities. The Nazi misinterpretation of Tacitus extended beyond selective quotation and deliberate omission. The Nazi scholars and ideologues also engaged in what might be called creative misreading. They took passages that Tacitus had written and interpreted them in ways that Tacitus almost certainly never intended. The most egregious example of this involves the Nazi interpretation of Tacitus's statement that the Germans are a people unto themselves. The Nazis took this phrase and interpreted it as a statement about racial purity, as evidence that the Germanic peoples had never mixed with other races, that they maintained a genetically pure bloodline. This interpretation was then used to justify the racial laws of Nazi Germany, including the prohibition on marriages between Aryans and Jews. But this interpretation almost certainly misrepresents what Tacitus meant. When Tacitus wrote that the Germans were a people unto themselves, he was almost certainly making a political or cultural observation, not a genetic or biological claim. He was noting that the Germanic peoples maintained their independence, that they had not been conquered and absorbed into the Roman Empire, that they maintained their own distinct culture and political organization. He was not making a claim about genetic purity or racial superiority. The Nazi regime, however, took this phrase and transformed it into a biological and racial claim. They used it to justify policies of racial segregation and ultimately genocide. The misinterpretation of a single phrase from Tacitus contributed directly to the deaths of millions of people. The Nazi scholars of the Ahnenerbe were not engaged in genuine historical research or scholarly interpretation. They were engaged in the systematic distortion of history in service of totalitarian ideology. They selected passages from Tacitus that seemed to support Nazi racial theories. They ignored or downplayed passages that contradicted those theories, and they deliberately misinterpreted passages to make them fit Nazi ideological requirements. This process of historical distortion was not unique to the Ahnenerbe's treatment of Tacitus. The Nazi regime engaged in similar distortions of history, archaeology, and anthropology across a wide range of topics. They rewrote history to support their ideological claims, they suppressed evidence that contradicted their theories, and they promoted pseudoscientific racial theories as if they were established fact. The tragedy is that this systematic distortion of history had real and murderous consequences. The racial theories that the Ahnenerbe promoted, the historical narratives they constructed, the pseudo-scientific justifications they provided for Nazi racial policies, all of this contributed to the creation of a worldview that was fundamentally evil, a worldview that justified the systematic murder of millions. But there is another crucial fact that the Nazi regime either ignored or deliberately concealed. Modern Germans could not possibly be the direct descendants of the Germanic tribes that Tacitus described. The Nazi regime made a fundamental error in their historical reasoning. They conflated the Germanic tribes of the 1st century AD with the German nation of the 20th century. They assumed that the Germanic peoples described by Tacitus were the direct ancestors of modern Germans, that there was an unbroken line of descent connecting ancient Germanic warriors to 20th century German citizens. But this assumption is historically inaccurate. The Germanic tribes of the 1st century AD were not the ancestors of modern Germans in any simple or direct sense. Over the course of nearly 2,000 years, the populations of Central Europe underwent enormous changes. There were migrations, invasions, conquests, and intermixtures with many different peoples. The Franks, the Saxons, the Bavarians, and other Germanic peoples who eventually formed the basis of the German nation were not simple continuations of the tribes that Tacitus described. Moreover, the very concept of a German nation did not exist in the 1st century AD. The Germanic tribes were independent political entities, often at war with each other, with no sense of common national identity. The idea of a unified German nation is a product of medieval and early modern history, not of ancient Germanic society. The Nazi regime's identification of modern Germans with the ancient Germanic tribes was a fundamental historical error, an error that was deliberately promoted and perpetuated by Nazi scholars and ideologues. This error was not accidental, it was deliberate. The Nazi regime needed to create a sense of historical continuity, a sense that modern Germans were the inheritors of an ancient and superior civilization. The misidentification of modern Germans with the ancient Germanic tribes served this ideological purpose. The truth is far more complex and far less flattering to Nazi racial ideology. Modern Germans are the descendants of many different peoples, not of a single ancient tribe. The population of Central Europe has been shaped by countless migrations, invasions, and intermixtures over the course of thousands of years. The story of the Codex Aeschines and Himmler's obsessive quest to possess it reveals something profound about the nature of totalitarian ideology and the dangers of historical distortion. It demonstrates how a sophisticated, educated leadership can embrace fundamentally flawed interpretations of historical texts, how selective reading and deliberate misquotation can be used to justify murderous policies, and how the weaponization of scholarship in service of ideology can have catastrophic consequences. Himmler's reading of Tacitus's Germania was not an isolated incident of scholarly misinterpretation. It was part of a broader pattern of historical distortion that characterized the Nazi regime. The Nazis systematically rewrote history to support their ideological claims. They suppressed evidence that contradicted their theories. They promoted pseudoscientific racial theories as if they were established fact. They created an entire institutional apparatus, the Ahnenerbe, dedicated to the distortion of history and the promotion of Nazi racial ideology. The consequences of this systematic distortion were catastrophic. Over 11 million people were murdered in Nazi concentration camps and extermination centers. The vast majority of these victims were Jewish, but the Nazi genocide also claimed the lives of Roma, disabled individuals, political prisoners, Soviet prisoners of war, and countless others deemed racially or socially undesirable. The direct line could be traced from Himmler's reading of Tacitus on a train in 1924 to the gas chambers of Auschwitz and Treblinka. The intellectual framework for genocide had been constructed, brick by brick, using Tacitus's words as the mortar. A Roman historian's rhetorical critique of Roman decadence, written nearly 2,000 years before, had been transformed into the intellectual justification for one of history's greatest atrocities. Yet there is also a more hopeful aspect to this story. The Codex Aeschines survived. Despite Himmler's obsessive quest to possess it, despite the presence of German troops throughout Italy, despite the chaos and destruction of war, the manuscript was preserved. The Balestri-Balani family, through courage and determination, protected the manuscript from Nazi seizure. They hid it in a secret room. They refused to surrender it to Mussolini's government. They risked their lives to preserve it. After the war, the manuscript was restored and preserved. It was eventually donated to a public institution where it could be studied by scholars from all nations. The Codex Aeschines is now available for examination by anyone who wishes to study it, to understand what Tacitus actually wrote, to recognize the extent to which the Nazi regime had distorted and misrepresented his text. This availability of the original manuscript has made it possible for modern scholars to correct the Nazi misinterpretation, to reveal the true nature of Tacitus's account, and to demonstrate the fundamental dishonesty of Nazi historical scholarship. The manuscript that Himmler had obsessed over, the text that he believed would validate Nazi racial ideology, has instead become a tool for exposing the falsehoods and distortions that the Nazi regime had perpetrated. The story of the Codex Aeschines reminds us of the importance of historical accuracy, of the dangers of selective interpretation, and of the responsibility that scholars and intellectuals bear to pursue truth rather than ideology. The quest for the Codex Aeschines, the hunt that consumed Himmler's attention and resources, ultimately proved futile. He never possessed the manuscript that he so desperately desired. He never had the opportunity to display it as a symbol of Nazi Germany's connection to its supposed Aryan past. The manuscript eluded him throughout his life, and after his death, it was preserved not as a Nazi relic, but as a historical document available to all humanity. This outcome carries a certain poetic justice. The man who had used Tacitus's words to justify the murder of millions never succeeded in obtaining the original text. The manuscript that he believed would validate his racial ideology instead became a tool for exposing the falsehoods and distortions that had characterized Nazi historical scholarship. The story of the Codex Aeschines is ultimately a story about the power of truth and the ultimate futility of lies. The Nazi regime attempted to rewrite history, to distort the past in service of their ideological goals, to use scholarship and intellectualism as tools of propaganda and genocide, but in the end, their distortions were exposed. The truth about what Tacitus actually wrote, about what the Germanic peoples were actually like, about the fundamental dishonesty of Nazi historical scholarship, all of this eventually came to light. The preservation of the Codex Aesinas, the survival of the original manuscript despite Himmler's obsessive quest to possess it, represents a triumph of truth over ideology, of historical accuracy over propaganda, of human decency over totalitarian evil. The manuscript that was meant to validate Nazi racial theories instead became evidence of the extent to which the Nazi regime had distorted history in service of genocide. If you enjoy stories like this, consider subscribing. Most people watching right now aren't subscribed yet.